Okay, welcome back to our series on her stories, his story, and our story, learning about and engaging with the past. We are on our fourth webinar today. I am Hasini Haputantri, the series moderator, and this series is organized by International Center for Ethnic Studies together with Rosa Luxembourg Foundation. So thank you for joining us again. And I want to give you a quick update about the webinar series so far and what we are going to do today. So far on the program, we've had three academic perspectives being shared. First by a historian, Dr. Nirmal Ranjit Devasiri. Secondly, we had Professor Jagat Veerasinghe, an archaeologist, sharing his perspective. And then we also had a non-historian and a non-archaeologist who nevertheless engages with the past, Professor Sasanka Pereira, speaking and sharing his view as a sociologist about approaching and engaging with the past. From today onwards, we want to shift our focus slightly towards the practitioner's perspective and tackle immediate practical problems and solutions. So before I introduce the speaker today, I want to, as usual, remind you about certain things about the webinar. First is the interpretation. You know that we have simultaneous interpretations in Sinhala and Tamil available. For those who want to follow the proceedings in Sinhala, please tune into the Chinese channel. You will see an icon for interpretation at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And if you click that, you will get a small menu that gives you the two options of Chinese and Japanese. In Chinese channel, you will hear the Sinhalese interpretation by Mr. Harindra Dasanayaka. And on the Japanese channel, you will be able to follow the proceedings in Tamil with Miss Humaira Arham. So that's about the interpretations, and then about live streaming. In case any of your colleagues could not register on time, they can still tune in live to the event through Facebook. Please go to the International Center for Ethnic Studies Facebook page, ICES Sri Lanka, and you can still join the webinar and even raise questions, which we will receive on Zoom platform. Thirdly, about the program format. So as usual, we hope to finish our session in 1.5 hours. For the first half an hour, we want to let our guest speaker share his or her perspectives today with us, and it will be followed by a Q&A for about 1 hour. So more instructions on Q&A when we get to that point. But right now, let me introduce Natasha Karunaratne, who is our speaker for today. So Natasha, you can see her. She has been a fellow of Asia Foundation and has also worked with International Center for Ethnic Studies, especially in helping International Center for Ethnic Studies to convert some of their research into more pedagogically pleasing and accessible information and material. So she has really done a lot of work by interviewing researchers, historians, history educators in Sri Lanka. And most of what she is going to present and share with us today will be from her experience and work on that direction. In 2020, she also published her work as a book, Barriers to Teaching Inclusive History, History Education as a Battleground. Today, she is working in Boston for En Route, an organization that's working with immigrant children to integrate into US society. So welcome, Natasha. It's lovely to see you again and to have you. So I think you are going to talk today out of the research that you have done, especially about the 7 areas that you have identified. And also your focus is going to be on modern history. For instance, we had speakers before you, Sasanka, Nirmal, and Jagat, who really touched upon ancient history on Sri Lanka, but your work is going to really focus on modern history and teaching of modern history. So we are very excited to hear what you have to say, and the floor is yours. Please do take over.
Thank you so much, Hasini, and the entire team at the International Center for Ethnic Studies for having me today. I'm so honored and really excited to be here. So I want to start today by asking you all a question. I want to ask you to think about a recent conflict in your society. So in my case, for example, in the US, I might take race relations. So think of any recent conflict in your society, and I want you to think about how you came to learn about that event. We're going to put out a quick poll so that we can ask you all to actually give us your answers for how you came to learn about that event in history. So think about what platform through which you learned about it. Did you learn about it from media, from TV, radio, or social media? Or did you learn about it at school, in a classroom, from a teacher, or in a textbook? From your family or your community? Or did you yourself live through that event? I'll give everyone a minute or so to fill the poll out before we see the results. Okay, I think we have just a few more seconds of the poll and then we'll launch our answers so we can all see them. Okay, so here we see from the answers that I hope all of you can see that about 63% of all of us here on the call today, about 80 of us, have learned about a recent event in history from media. A small 9% have learned about it from school, 18% from family or their community, and 11% have lived through the event themselves. So I'm going to share my screen now. So what we saw in the poll is fairly similar to what I have experienced in my own experience of Sri Lankan history. So I will take Black July, for example. For any of those on the call who might not know what Black July was, for context, it was Sri Lanka's infamous 1983 riots that served as a catalyst to a nearly 3-decade-long civil war. So in my own experience, I did not live through Black July. I came to learn about it through stories. Stories from my family, from my community, from the media I sought out, just like we saw in the poll. My bet from asking you all that question was that most of us had not learned about recent parts of our history in school. Whether it be ethnic war or race relations or class struggles, it's through all these different platforms, from our media, our family, from our own lived experience, that we have learned these recent parts of our society. Now, I think this could be the case for a number of reasons. For one, the conflict itself might be too recent. It might not be so easy to neatly package into a story that we can convey to children. If I asked many about the recent conflicts that we all brought to mind, they might tell me that's not politics, that's not history rather, that's politics. And many would say it's perhaps too recent and too raw, too close to the emotions of personal experience to be considered history. Now, if you're in that bucket, that the recent event you thought of, you say to yourself, that's not history, that's politics. I have something for you to consider. I am 23 years old. I was born in 1997, right in the middle of Sri Lanka's nearly 30-year-long civil war. And no one thought it was likely appropriate to tell a small child about an ethno-religious civil war and the violence that occurred during that war. So by the time I was 12 in 2009 and the war was proclaimed over, I hadn't really learned much about what had happened in Sri Lanka. After the war's end, it wasn't very much in the news for me in the US. It wasn't talked about very heavily. There was a lot of trauma that had been experienced, and it was still taboo. It was very hushed. It wasn't open and talked about. So because this part of our past wasn't considered history and I didn't learn about it really, I grew up hardly knowing anything about the events that some might say are the most important to understanding Sri Lanka's present day. And of course, I grew up in the US, so I thought, this is likely unique to me. Surely Sri Lankan youth learn much, much more about the war and their recent past than I did. So when I came to Sri Lanka for a fellowship 2 years ago, I was so excited. I was so eager to talk to teachers and students and finally get my hands on a Sri Lankan history textbook and flip through it and see, okay, where's the war? Where's that chapter in this textbook? I, for one, surely need to read that. But when I got to Sri Lanka, I realized that that chapter doesn't exist. Teachers aren't really discussing the war with students. It's not on the national exam. It's not going to help them get ahead in any way necessarily through formal education. It's not in the curriculum, so there's no room to teach it. And then lastly, if a teacher was to think, okay, this is an important part of our past, and really talk to their students about what happened, they might be considered radical or a terrorist or spreading propaganda to Sri Lanka's youth. So I came to realize that the experience of Sri Lankan youth was shockingly pretty similar to my own. The phenomena of considering recent history too recent and too emotional to be considered history has left out my generation in the dark about the past that's impacting the future and present that we're trying to navigate today. And when we do learn about that part of our past, we usually learn about it from our family or our community. For the most part, we're learning about history from people who look and perhaps think like us, who share the same identity as us. For instance, a single parent might tell their children the experience that they had of Black July, while a Tamil family might tell their children their own experience of Black July. What's happening is that there are two different versions of this history coexisting. And of course, both stories have the possibility of having bias in them. In fact, I believe, as I'll share in this presentation, that all historical knowledge is biased in some way. But the danger lies in the false pretense that what we learn about the past is absolute truth. That what we learn from our families, from the media, from our community is absolute truth. And this is extremely dangerous because clashes are bound to happen between two groups in society who insist that their version of the past is reality. The phenomena has already proven to be really damaging, as one researcher I spoke to shared with me that the lack of knowledge of youth, even youth in war zones, is astoundingly wrong. As time passes between a generation with lived experience of an event, a generation that lived through that event, the war in this example, As time passes between that generation and the generation who hears stories about it, my generation, the ones who come to learn about it through media, through our family, what's passed down is not truth, but perception. One generation's perception of that past is passed to the next generation. One generation's understanding of the war, in fact, becomes the war itself to future generations. And as trauma erodes an oral history, we're left with a really diminishing story of the past. Like for my example, how I didn't really learn about it growing up. As our oral history diminishes, we're really left in a dire situation. One scholar I spoke to told me that the anti-Muslim riots in 6 villages scattered throughout the Kandy district and its aftermath is remarkably like the anti-minority riots since 1915. This is critical for us to know. And yet, if our future generations are not learning about and understanding the past, there's no way for them to recognize the patterns of ethno-religious violence. There's no way for them to know that the riots we see today against Muslims are very similar to what we've been seeing throughout history. And by the time that we realize that this is a pattern, it's too late. The violence has already occurred. So the question becomes, why? Why in a society burdened with ethno-religious tensions and a lack of shared history, does history education continue to exclude marginalized histories and silo communities over ethno-religious divides? When history education has so much potential to give us a shared history to the future generation, why has Sri Lanka's history education largely not changed? To answer these questions, I had to unpack the structural barriers and obstacles that we see to including inclusive history education. When I looked at these barriers, I found 6 areas of influence, or pillars, if you will, of history education that are shaping the context in Sri Lanka. These pillars include history as an emotional and biased discipline, the textbooks that students are learning from, the translation process of those textbooks, the teachers, the pedagogy through which history is being taught, and the exam-oriented context in which all of this sits. So I want to start today by looking at history as a discipline. History, well, let me start here. The first of these things that I think is imperative to understanding how history education plays out in Sri Lanka is the foundational concept that is true for history all over the world, that history as a discipline is an inherently biased and emotional subject. Now, when some of you hear this, you might be asking yourself, emotional, what is she talking about? What does she mean? Well, let's take another subject and compare them, for example. So let's take geography. If I'm learning in geography class about soil and sediment, that soil doesn't really have a personal connection to my past. It's not really emotional to me. I can touch soil, and likely the person next to me can touch that soil and feel the same thing. But from the point of view of history, when you're talking about a country and who founded that country, when you're talking about who belongs in a place and who does not, that is extremely personal. It's extremely emotional for whether your family and community is included or excluded in that story. I think history is very often trivialized as dates and names as people long gone. And as Neera Wickramasinghe, a scholar who I very much look up to, put it, history isn't just the facts of things happening in order, but ideologies behind why things happened, whether it be religious change, communalism, Sinhala nationalisms, Tamil separatism. History gives us the answers for why something happened. That's what it attempts to do. And for this reason, history in its nature cannot be devoid of bias nor emotion. As the people, stories, and concepts we choose to demarcate history will always include some and exclude others. It will always prioritize one group and exclude and marginalize another group. The biases that we learn throughout history are particularly important in Sri Lanka's post-war context, as these historical biases relate to ethnicity and religion in a post-war society. One researcher I spoke to found that in relation to the question, what nation is being built in Sri Lankan history education, it is the Sinhala Buddhist nation under the guise of the Sri Lankan nation, as there's a tendency for these two things to be synonymous. Mihiri shared with me from her research that even as she was talking to curriculum developers, the terms Sri Lankan and Sinhala were being used interchangeably without them even realizing it. When evaluating how diversity is dealt with in history curriculum, she concludes that minorities are sidelined. Tamils are portrayed as invaders, Muslims are non-existent. They're not really even mentioned in the history curriculum until colonial years. You can imagine a Muslim student is left feeling like they don't know about what the past of their community looked like prior to that time in history. Another study found that the Sinhala bias in history that's taught at a mainstream level has resulted in Tamil students losing interest in the subject. One study in 1998 found that only 65 students chose to continue in history education, to take their O-level and A-level exam with history as their core, compared to the 5,335 Sinhala students who went on with history. That's only 1% of the total students who majored in history that year in 1998 were Tamil as opposed to Sinhala. And this is compared to the population statistic that the Tamil population was 11% in 1998, but only 1% majored in history. I think what's crucial here to understand is that that phenomena did not just affect that generation in 1998. The whole trend continues to impact us today, as the less minority students who are interested in history and went on to major in history means that today we have less minority curriculum developers. What's crucial here is that this pattern we see in front of us is cyclical. The more that curriculum is biased towards Sinhala Buddhists, the less minority students we're going to have who are interested in studying history, and the less curriculum developers we're going to have who really relate to the experiences that we're talking about today when we say an inclusive history. Speaking of curriculum developers, I'd like to look at our next pillar today, textbooks. Textbooks are often thought of as the most significant pathway through which history is passed down from one generation to another. But I want to make a key distinction here. I believe that textbooks are a key pathway that transfer one generation's perception of history to the next generation. As we discussed earlier, I think history in itself is perceptions. So it brings me to ask, whose perception is being passed down? Just as Mihiri found in her research on the discipline of history, I think textbooks have the same answer to be true, that it's the Sinhala Buddhist perception being passed down, as the production process of history textbooks entirely sits in the Sri Lankan government. This creates a system in which a predominantly Sinhala group of people are writing, publishing, and distributing all textbooks to the entire country. This enables textbooks to be used as a single story, as a single perception that can prioritize Sinhala Buddhist perceptions to all of Sri Lanka's youth, regardless of what ethno-religious group is the majority in any given part of the country. One telling example of the prominence that Sinhala Buddhism is given in textbooks is the key example of the battle between Dudugamanu and Alada. For anyone on the call who's joining us from outside of the Sri Lankan context, this battle is incredibly important to Sri Lankan history. So Dutugamanu is a Sinhala king and Alara is a Tamil king. And this story was recorded in the Mahavamsa, the great chronicles of Sri Lankan history. And the Mahavamsa itself is claimed to suggest that the Sinhala king Dutugamanu defeated the foreign Tamil king Alara. It gives us the perception that Alara himself was foreign to society, and that by Dutugamanu winning this battle, he was protecting Buddhism, reuniting the country, and liberating the country from so-called foreign rule. When we begin to understand history with these tones placed on this battle, we begin to come into what Nirmal Devasiri spoke to in the first webinar in this series, the difference of good myths versus bad myths. The Dutugamanu Alara battle is considered one of the most foundational myths in how the Sinhala Buddhist state considers its belonging in Sri Lanka. But it is crucial to understand that even in this foundational story, the history we see is built on the exclusion of Tamils from history. What's really interesting to me is that despite the Sri Lankan government distributing, creating all of history textbooks for the entire country, there is actually varying perceptions and varying versions of this one battle, the Dutugamanu Alara battle, which brings me to the translation process of our textbooks. One of the biggest things I took away from my research is that textbooks are continuously named the cornerstone, the most important tool to history education reform. But all of the scholars, teachers, policymakers I spoke to shared with me that there's actually an entire system within our history education in Sri Lanka, entire trends happening around history textbooks, that if we don't look at the entire story, we will miss the crucial places where we should be implementing our reforms. I think a great example of that is the translation process of textbooks. First, I'll give you some context here for anyone who's joining us outside of Sri Lanka. Sri Lanka gained independence from Britain in 1948, and one of its highest priorities was education reform, especially as it pertained to language. The newly formed nation went about making schools more accessible to a larger population of Sri Lankans by reinstating Sri Lanka's mother tongues of Sinhala and Tamil and replacing the English medium in schools. However, this change in language and instruction also created a system that we now see today. We're an ethnically and religiously segregated school system, wherein different ethnic groups were educated in separate schools in their own language of instruction. During the time that Sinhala and Tamil curriculum were divided separately, there began to arise fears amongst the Sinhala group that Tamil curriculum was creating ties with South India rather than with Sri Lanka. This swell of Sinhala nationalism and really fear-mongering that Tamils were having ties with a different country caused the Sri Lankan government to instate the law that they did in 1980, which remains today. The predominantly Sinhala government mandates that all curriculum be produced, standardized, and distributed by them solely while operating in Sinhala, meaning that textbooks are only translated to Tamil and English after the fact. Now, for some, this might seem logical and obvious, but I in fact think that we need to explore this dynamic and how dangerous it can be. The National Institute of Education and the Educational Publications Department solely operate in Sinhala today. And that creates a dynamic that really prevents most Tamils who are not fluent in writing and reading and speaking Sinhala, from directly authoring the history curriculum and engaging in the discussions that are happening about what is marketed as history and what is not. By greatly excluding Tamils and Muslims from the production process, something as overlooked as translation plays a key role in creating a history textbook that like the ones we see today, that are biased towards Sinhala history. Despite the translation process's mandate to develop curriculum in Sinhala and then translate it to Tamil and English, Tamil and Sinhala textbooks have a different level of quality and even variance in their content. When I spoke to Chandima Dannapala, one of a two-people department at the National Institute of Education that focuses on history, she shared with me that the translators that are often hired are Muslim to translate into Tamil. This means that Tamil textbooks are often using words that are unique to Muslim Tamils and perhaps indecipherable at times to Tamil students in other parts of the country. It's creating a system in which Tamil textbooks are not given as much care as Sinhala textbooks. When the Sinhala textbook is being created, there's so much debate over the exact language that is used amongst professional historians. But for the Tamil and English textbooks, the textbook is handed to a single translator. And often that translator's background is in translation, not in history. This means that sometimes we see textbooks that are translated word by word rather than by meaning. Tamil students are pushed aside, and the textbook that they're given is not at adequate standards compared to the Sinhala textbook. What's most concerning to me here is that there's also a lack of materials for teachers that are available in Tamil, for both Tamil and Muslim teachers, that even the guides they're given for how they can support their students in learning the curriculum is mostly available in Sinhala. We need to shift the ways that we are prioritizing education in the country to see what an inclusive education would look like. This brings me to the next piece of the puzzle of history education, teachers. As we unpack each component of the history education structure, the ones who I believe bear the heaviest of weight amongst all these systemic barriers are teachers themselves. We can start by looking at who are Sri Lanka's history teachers and what types of supports they're given. Many assume that anyone can teach history, that it's as simple as teaching names and dates out of a textbook. But this assumption fails to recognize that history is completely different than other disciplines. Historical knowledge is much, much more complex than, say, scientific or mathematical knowledge. And you might be saying, what? How does that even make sense? Well, I'll explain. In science or math, we might be presented a fact and say, okay, that is always true, no matter what. In math, for example, 2 + 2 is always equal to 4. There's no question about it. But when it comes to historical knowledge, truth is always subjective and can and should be questioned. It's not absolute truth that Dutu Gamanu was a good king and Alara was a bad king. That knowledge is impacted by bias and it should be questioned. Therefore, it takes much more than reading a textbook to teach history. It takes a great deal of training in how to handle such sensitive material and teach the skills of critical thinking. After all, we're talking about a subject as sensitive as ethno-religious identity in a post-war country. So the responsibility of a history teacher cannot be taken lightly. Yet, this assumption that anyone can teach history has already proved to be extremely damaging to Sri Lanka. There is an unspoken, yet extremely prevalent trend of placing teachers that do not have a background in history to teach in history classrooms. For example, we see science teachers or math teachers teaching history during their free periods. Chandima Dannapala of the National Institute of Education estimates that as many as half of history teachers at the grade school level in Sri Lanka do not have a formal background in history. Not only are these teachers not trained to handle the emotion and bias that is inherent to this subject, but they're also forced to use a pretty problematic textbook as their only teaching crutch as they teach students history. This leaves a lot of room for the teacher's own bias to come out in how they teach history. And I don't want to be mistaken as blaming teachers for this. In fact, these teachers are spread extremely thin by being asked to teach multiple disciplines during their free periods and ones that they don't have a background in. But I do want us to understand that no one is devoid of bias. No one is objective. So when teachers teach history and particularly don't have a formal background in history, there's much more room for the bias that they've learned in their own education to be ad-libbed, to add to the textbook story to make it more colorful for students. For example, if a teacher watched the Battle of Dutugamanu and Elara in a teledrama, for example, they're more likely to ad-lib to the teaching of the textbook with the biased view they might be presented in a teledrama. Moreover, the repercussions that teachers face for teaching outside of the mandated curriculum unequally fall on teachers who are teaching inclusive histories, particularly if the history is discussing the darker parts of history, like the war. Tamil teachers reported getting in trouble for covering things not on the syllabus, not only because they were viewed as not prioritizing their students by not teaching what was on the national exams, but also because they were viewed as having ties with the LTTE if they were trying to teach about what happened in the war. A Tamil teacher I spoke to shared that we don't really talk about politics. Peace is an also sensitive topic. We can't talk about it. The way our society is polarized, even the staff is polarized. Peace and politics, you can't separate them. People can't talk about it openly. There's no freedom of speech here. However, if a Sinhala teacher wants to teach the story of Vijaya, for example, a story that is biased towards Sinhala Buddhist national or identity, but has been already removed from textbooks, if a teacher wants to teach that curriculum that's already outside of the mandated curriculum, there isn't really a repercussion for them. These unfair repercussions create a system in which teachers' bias is given room to flourish if and only if those biases are in favor of the Sinhala majority and do not expose the atrocities of the war. I believe that the hardest part of reimagining history education in Sri Lanka is the many contexts that we're structured in, where a classroom is highly constrained by the exams, by the teachers, by everything around what is happening between the teacher and the student right there. Sometimes the most important factor to learning is not the content nor the teacher, but how the content is taught. Which brings me to our next pillar, pedagogy. Pedagogy, in its simplest terms, is the method through which one is taught or something is taught. Not only in Sri Lanka, but globally, there's a pedagogical emphasis on memorization and what critical pedagogist Paulo Freire calls the banking method. The banking method is the idea that students are empty vessels, ready to be filled with knowledge, and objective knowledge for that matter, rather than viewing students as students who bring their own experience, their own knowledge to the classroom. The key way we see the banking method playing out in Sri Lankan history education is with the chalk and talk technique. So this is what we would see if we walked into a classroom. We would see a teacher writing at the front of the classroom and students paying attention, students memorizing, students taking notes. This chalk and talk technique is only used because teachers have such a limited amount of time. Teachers have 45 minutes to teach nearly 45 students, and lecturing becomes one of the easiest ways to facilitate memorization. It's the easiest ways to teach answers, not to question. For this reason, the pedagogy of lecturing within the banking model is always prioritized over what we call critical pedagogy, or the prioritization of discussion, critical thinking, questioning, because it recognizes, critical pedagogy recognizes that knowledge is biased and personal, that it should be questioned. But in Sri Lankan history education classrooms, we don't have room for that. We don't have time for that. Teachers are not the only agents pushing the Sri Lankan education to value certain pedagogies over others. In fact, they're just a pawn here, really, that's causing them to teach in this particular method. The most damaging part of this pedagogy is that students are taught that historical knowledge consists of right and wrong, that rather than critical questioning, that they should learn the answer to the question. For teaching youth inclusive histories, I believe that teaching critical questioning and critical thinking skills is a gift that would keep on giving. It's really probably the most crucial thing we can do with students is teach them how to question the knowledge they're being presented. Because then in the future, when we're talking about things that aren't even on our radar right now as being biased, our students in the future will be able to know that for themselves. Finally, the last pillar I want to speak to is the context in which all of this sits, in which textbooks, teachers, pedagogy, it all sits within the culture of an exam-oriented education. One of the many colonial legacies that remains in Sri Lanka is an exam-oriented structure of A levels and O levels, a structure in which students compete against each other for university slots. In an environment that's so highly competitive, where exam scores serve as a gateway ticket to university admissions and career opportunities, youth are coerced into an exam-oriented culture. In Sri Lanka, we see a high prevalence of private tuition, and that refers to outside of school teaching to teach towards the A-level and O-level exam. So much so that if you don't put a student in tuition, you could be considered failing that child. It's extremely prevalent for children in elementary school level or secondary school level to be in tuition outside of school. Because national exams often are not reformed at the same timing or extent to which our textbooks are reformed and our teaching is reformed, we often see single-centric bias lessons being removed from textbooks, but remaining in national exams. So this creates a system in which private tuition is still going to teach a single-centric lesson because the student needs it for the exam, but it's not being taught in school perhaps. Lopez Cardozo argues that in a situation where teachers feel pressured to just live up to the exam standards without time and space for other peace-related activities, there tends to be a lack of reflective and critical dialogue in the classroom. Both teachers and principals that I spoke to complained that the exam-oriented system does not have enough room for the integration of peace education. Not only are teachers' course loads too heavy to include peace education, but the structure is so exam-oriented that Sinhala and Tamil teachers alike must make room to teach Sinhala-centric lessons just because they will appear on the national exam. The education system is so prevalent that tuition masters conduct lectures in grand halls on weekends and evenings that can fit as many as 1,000 students at a time. Pedagogically, tuition teaches answers, not to ask questions. And as one intention is to have the one intention of tuition is to have students succeed on their exams, the supplementary materials that tuition masters teach are of the Sinhala Buddhist bias. Because the NIE has removed some of these bias stories from textbooks, but teachers still can teach them in tuition where they're paid outside of school, we find that Sinhala-centric lessons are profitable, in fact, in comparison to Tamil lessons. In comparison, Tamil teachers are pressured to use exam scores to measure success, so they often teach a Sinhala-centric lesson as well, just for the survival of their students. But if their students say, Miss, we'd really love to learn about our own community, our own stories, they're forced to teach that outside of school without any monetized value given to them for that supplementary teaching compared to tuition masters who are paid to teach Sinhala-centric lessons. In this structure, teaching supplementary Sinhala lessons is highly profitable, while teaching Tamil-centric lessons are provided as a free service by already overworked teachers. So now that we've unpacked the landscape, which is history education in Sri Lanka, we can begin to understand what reforms can be put in place. How do we overcome and circumvent these barriers? It brings me to the question, when the war and other dark parts of history are finally considered history, how can we work to ensure that multiple perspectives and inclusive histories are taught mainstream? So today, I'm gonna walk us through a few examples of interventions that have been put in place to circumvent the obstacles we just heard about. Before we do that, I want to look at, here we go. I want to look at the importance of a multi-pronged approach. What I mean by a multi-pronged approach is that we're looking at all of the systems we just talked about. When I talked to scholars and teachers and curriculum developers in my research, there was a common theme throughout that we must be addressing all of the characteristics that we see in Sri Lankan history education, not just one. What happens if we try to address just one of these is that it's very similar to trying to topple a six-legged stool by removing one leg. The stool, the barriers of history education will remain standing. Instead, we need to topple 4, 5, 6 at a time to really change, to really make implementable and tangible impact. For example, if one is to revise textbooks without also revising exams within a highly exam-oriented environment, there lacks an actual shift in the curriculum because students at the end of the day will still learn Sinhala-centric lessons to prepare for their exams. In another example, if we're to reimagine teacher training and really teach teachers how to handle the sensitivity and bias of history curriculum, we also need to look at the fact that they don't have enough time to really implement all of these new pedagogies into their classroom. We need to look at the fact that students are used to the rote memorization pedagogy, and we would need to have an open conversation about how our pedagogy is also going to change. In order for us to approach history education reforms using informed and strategic methods, we must look at what has been done. We must learn from what we've tried and learn how to combine our efforts so that we can topple this stool. We can talk about multiple of these structures at one time. So I want to walk through a few examples of interventions that have been put forth in Sri Lanka. The first one is with teacher trainings. So as explained previously, as many as half of grade school teachers in Sri Lanka do not have a formal training in history education. And many teachers are trained in other disciplines. So for the other half, the half that are trained in history, I wanted to learn more about what their training looks like. Their training happens at the National College of Education or at the university level. Today, only 9 of the 17 universities in Sri Lanka teach history as a major, with each university having a distinct belief system that they teach for history. So for example, the University of Kelaniya and Sri Jayawardhanapura are originally established institutions for the higher education of Buddhist monks. So today we see these institutions as the foundational place where our Sinhala Buddhist ancient history is being explored. In comparison, the University of Colombo has actually moved away from teaching in a chronological order and moved towards teaching thematically. So what this means is they might teach the history of capitalism or gender in history, for example, as a theme, rather than chronological history. Similarly, Jaffna University is categorized as promoting regional history, so advancing Tamil historical narratives that are often otherwise excluded. Knowing how isolated universities are in their pedagogical and ideological methods of teaching history, professors and activists work together to establish History and Community, a program to unite students from different history departments across Sri Lanka's universities to explore how their multiple interpretations of history fit together. And I'm actually extremely honored because my moderator today, Hassani, was a founding member of the team that started History and Community, the program. So in its more recent years, this History and Community program worked with the University of Jaffna and the University of Colombo, bringing Tamil and Sinhala students together and exploring with them how they've learned history and comparing those different versions of history, comparing those stories. The program was structured by bringing two cohorts together to one historical site for half a day of activity and exploring and lecture that site for the other half a day. They would ask students what they already knew about a subject and unpack the differences and similarities that they see in their respective interpretations. Already here, we can see a different use of pedagogy. It's not rote memorization. It is critical thinking and critical questioning. Recognizing that students in particular regions of post-war Sri Lanka often have trauma that goes unacknowledged, GIZ implemented an entirely different teacher training program, which is also very notable. They implemented an intervention in which teachers and guidance counselors are trained in psychological counseling. This training is offered to 2 education professionals at each school. And this was really key because the pedagogy of teaching psychological counseling is so different than the pedagogy of teaching another discipline that you really need 2 educators to be working together on it at each school. The model was structured that the 2 trained professionals can return to their school and carry out trainings for even more teachers on how to promote psychological education, how to promote social and emotional learning, and problem solving amongst their students. Given this, the methodology is not only centered around the content of social and psychological counseling, but also training teachers in pedagogy and facilitation, training teachers in how to facilitate a conversation and helping them do the same for their students. Moreover, the teachers who were given this training were equipped with the tools they needed to question their own biases and then to teach students to question theirs. The next interventions I want to look at are ones that were done by the government, by government-led initiatives. The first is to look at the changes and implementations that President Chandrika Bandaranaike Kumaratunga put forward during her presidency from 1994 to 2005. So she's often lauded as the first mainstream political leader who publicly acknowledged that Tamils in Sri Lanka had been given a real grievance and that they had been subjected to various forms of discrimination under post-colonial Sri Lankan government. So what she did was she appointed Thara de Mel as secretary to the Ministry of Education, and together they brought new voices into the history production process. With their leadership, the World Bank was brought in to give the National Institute of Education more direction in developing history curricula in a post-war country. And they were given a team of educators who were brought together to rethink the curriculum alongside the National Institute of Education. They called for the removal of the concept of biological race, such as the Aryan race, and instead called for the reframing of history as structures of social and economic forces, not just political history. However, they also wanted to ensure that their proposal would be passed and well received, wasn't trying to change the entire system at once. They really wanted to focus on working within the systems that we had. By working together with the National Institute of Education, they were able to actually have their proposal accepted by the ministry. And soon, But soon as Kumaratunga's time was over as president, the proposal wasn't put anywhere. It was ended. And sadly, the interviewers I spoke to recounted this trend happening numerous times, that they would implement something at the government level, but the second there was a change in power, they didn't actually see those reforms come to fruition.
So, Natasha, I'm just going to interject here. We are going through a very, very interesting discussion that what you are presenting, but I also want to just remind you that there are a lot of questions coming up. So since we have only half an hour now to raise questions, for you to maybe, I mean, I do agree that the examples that you're presenting are extremely important for us to go through, but maybe we could also look at some of your conclusions quickly, and then return to the examples during the Q&A where people can also ask questions. Yeah, please.
Okay, that sounds good. Why don't we move towards the conclusion then? So I'm gonna go forward past NGO initiatives and peace camps. And hopefully we can talk about these two more in the Q&A. So in my conclusion, I wanted to share that a common thread amongst the scholars, educators, and government workers and community organizers that I spoke to, there was a common thread for the need to shift the understanding of historiography, for history to not be viewed as objective, as mere facts happening in order, happening on certain dates, but as an interpretive subject that holds many, many truths. In order to change the status quo and break the tendency for history education in Sri Lanka to prioritize singular Buddhist narratives and throw marginalized narratives under the rug, we must fight for history to be presented as multiple truths and teach these coexisting narratives. Through this reframing, reformists hope to re-engage students from being passive consumers of history to being individuals who utilize critical thinking skills and questioning to interpret and evaluate the history they're being presented. This shift in the understanding of what history is and what it looks like is also a key shift in the pedagogy that we're using, as educators want to use more innovative pedagogies to promote this critical thinking skills. For example, Janaki Jayawardena, an amazing professor at the University of Colombo, encourages her students to go outside of the classroom, to showcase the history that belongs to the community, and to teach them to read a historical site, to go to an archaeological site, for example, and really read what is happening there, what stories are being prioritized and what stories are being excluded. Interwoven in all of these examples is the pursuit to use history education to teach students the stories of the past that are rarely documented. From the history of influential women in Sri Lanka to communities like the Burghers and the Vedas, groups that are often marginalized. From the changing landscape of the environment to the impact the class and caste system have had throughout history. History education must be expanded to be comprehensive of the wide scope of Sri Lankan identity and the richness of the past. History education is often very controversial. It runs a high risk of discontent with so many vested interests and moving pieces running in contradiction of each other. And yet, every time we put it off, every time we convince ourselves that it's not worth the effort, that it's someone else's problem, future generations of Sri Lankans are learning a single narrative of history, and a biased one at that. Another reform process will begin this year. The textbooks are only revised every roughly 5 years, and this year, 2020, is the year of the next revision. So we are in a critical moment to really make a change. But the good news is that no one needs to do it alone. The real motivation for my research was to put everyone who's working in history education in conversation with each other, for activists working on peace camps, and NGOs working on teacher trainings to be in conversation with policymakers working on textbooks. And through this collaboration, I'm hoping that we can use this project to serve as a catalyst to combining our efforts, to toppling the multiple legs of the stool, not just one. As we take on this ever-going task of doing better for future generations in society, I remind myself of Paulo Freire's wise words. There's no such thing as neutral education. Education either functions as an instrument to bring about conformity or freedom. It is up to us to choose. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much, Natasha, for that lovely presentation. And I'm saying that because over the last 3 webinars, we've been listening to a historian, an archaeologist, and a sociologist actually go through the issues of approaching history as disciplinarians, as the discipline of history, as theoreticians. And your talk today really grounds all of them and brings us to the very, very real situations that we have to address and we are facing right now in our country. So thank you so much for bringing us down to the reality of the situation here and for really doing it in depth. The way I appreciate is that the details that you brought in through your research and observations. One could always say, oh, we already know that, but I think it's so important at this point to put that on the table and reflect that. So thank you so much for that effort, that detail, and your insights. So we have quite a few questions coming up. So I'll give you one comment first from Natalia Nikolova from Bulgaria. Thank you, Natasha, for enhancing on the importance of using various methodology as well as the role of Paulo Freire legacy and work on the importance of versatile methods to be used in formal education as well. So that's just a comment and a compliment to you. I'll just start it with that. Then we have Vasanta Dias with a question that is both interesting and philosophical. He is asking, is history so important in the modern curriculum? So I think that's a very fundamental question that many people think today. Do we really put a lot of energy into teaching history? That's what he's asking. What is your reaction to that?
Yeah, so I think that the thing that comes to mind first is that our history and our present aren't so distinct from one another. I think that the critical thing about history education and why, in my view, it's so important is that there's so much for us to learn from the past, from what happened, but not just what happened, what is known as traditional history, but also people's perceptions of that history. So in the example I gave earlier in the presentation, one researcher that I read shared that the anti-Muslim riots we see in Sri Lanka today are shockingly similar to the anti-minority riots we've seen since 1915 and onwards. But if students don't learn that history, they're not able to read patterns. I think patterns are the most interesting thing to me in history. That, for example, in the US context, I learned a lot about the Holocaust here in schools. And by looking at that conflict, by studying everything that happened to get to where we got at the end of the Holocaust, I'm able to look at other post-war, post-conflict situations and recognize patterns, recognize what happens when we start identifying certain people and excluding others. And those patterns are really where critical thinking comes up, where really the motivation for someone to take a stand, I think, comes from the patterns and stories we learn. So for me, that's why history is so important.
Exactly. So we have quite a few questions going in the same direction, and I'm going to try and couple them up. So first is from Deepthi. He says, thank you for talking about this very interesting topic. History is such a vast subject that can have many interpretations, as we learned from the earlier speakers. If so, how much of it do you think can be included in history education in schools? Can you compare it with history education in schools in other countries? And in fact, there are quite a few questions that go into the direction of the last question. For instance, Vihanga Pereira is also asking, as a reference point, can you direct us to a country in South Asia or Southeast Asia region with ethno-nationalist pluralism, as we have in Sri Lanka, that teaches history without a bias on a majority group? So that's one question. The other one is about, in your research, did you come across any organizations that were able to do this in other countries? Also, Kevin Shani also says, what can other countries learn from Sri Lanka's context, or we can learn from them? So there are quite a few. So I'll let you answer the first one, which is about how much of this complexity can we really accommodate? And then what can we learn from other countries in handling this situation?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think from my research, I realized that we cannot take our full forced approach through one method. So the history education I imagine for the future, the one that I think would be the most beneficial to students, I don't think we'll have that version of history education in a classroom or through a textbook for a long time. I think actually it'll happen through a combined methods approach. So, for example, Sri Lanka is really lauded for its experience doing peace camps. So putting students from a Sinhala school, students from a Tamil school into a camp together for a few days, maybe during a school vacation, living together, learning curriculum together, even in multiple languages, and learning from each other. So peace camps is a really great example, I think, of the ways that we can reimagine history education outside of the classroom. It's one that you can implement right away. There's barriers, of course. You have to pass it through principals and parents, but there's not as many bureaucratical barriers. You don't have to go through the Ministry of Education, for example, to implement a peace education curriculum. And by doing this outside of the classroom, we actually have a lot more different methods in our hands. We can use critical thinking pedagogy. We're not constrained to 45 minutes. We're not constrained to teaching to A levels or O levels. There's a lot more freedom. So I think that outside of the history classroom is actually where we'll see the more exciting innovations come up. And down the line, we should be learning from them to make changes in the classroom as well.
What about the question about learning from, other countries? For instance, any examples that you can think of?
Yeah, this is a really exciting question for me because I think that's where a lot of our innovation is going to come from, learning from other societies who have been through similar conflicts as ours and how they took history education after that. So a few examples come to mind. One is an example of an international peace camp that works globally. So there's an organization called Seeds of Peace. And Seeds of Peace is a globally run organization that runs peace camps between two groups of youth whose societies have had a conflict with each other. So they run peace camps with Israeli and Palestinian youth. They began recently running peace camps between Indian and Pakistani youth. And they also do a few with students of different races here in the US as well. So Seeds of Peace is a great example to me of what it can look like to have lessons learned from one society and go about implementing them in another. I think that we should also be very realistic about it though, because it will never work that you can take one solution from one country and just drop it in another. We always need to be working with people on the ground who know the education system well, know what the students are going through well in order to implement it correctly.
Yeah, here's another very interesting question from Harshana Tushar Silva. During all these webinar series, we talked about history, teaching history, yet we haven't focused on teaching contemporary history. Actually, that's what Natasha tried to do as well. But Harshana raises this question. If you take post-independent era, there we can come to an issue of biased history. If you take, for example, of Sinhala Only Act, JVP insurgencies and civil war, how can we overcome these issues? That's actually about teaching contemporary history. How many thoughts on that?
That's a great question. I forget exactly which study it was I read, but I believe the Sinhala Only Act is mentioned in I think grade 7 history textbooks only once throughout the whole textbook. It's a small section for a law that has changed our entire country for the future. So I think that there's multiple ways that changes should be made, but the examples you gave of the Sinhala Only Act, the JVP insurrection, I think these are current histories that need to be included in the classroom. Right now, the Sri Lankan history education stops around 1970. And that is more than half of the years that we have been in our independence. There's really such a critical mass of the history that has happened in this country that our students are missing out on. Similar to my own experience that I shared, when you don't learn about the histories in a classroom through a textbook, when it's left to your family to teach you, the media to teach you these incredibly critical stories, not only might the trauma of these histories not be passed down because it's too traumatic to bring up, but it will also cause a situation in which different identities of the country, different people learn different versions of the story.
Yeah, thank you. Quickly reminding all our attendees to use the Q&A box to direct questions to Natasha, because if you are typing them in the chat box, we are likely to sort of lose them because the chat box is moving very fast. So for us to keep track of the questions, it'll be really helpful if you use the Q&A box. And also please help us prioritize them by liking some of the questions up or down. So Harshan has a follow-up question, and I'm going to throw it up to you simply because I think it's very important. It's touching on something very important about the translations. So he's asking about the whole issue that you talked about, translating history curricula, and what could you suggest as an alternative to, working in English, or he's just asking, and I think that's a very important question.
Can you repeat that one, Hasani?
So it's about the translation issue in the history curriculum, and he's asking if English is the way forward.
Oh, that is an interesting question. I think that the struggle with that is that if we pick one language, we will always be excluding a voice. So if we were to pick English as the language that the NIE, the MOE, the Ministry of Education, National Institute of Education, Educational Publications Department, these three institutions that are key to shaping education and history education in Sri Lanka, if they were all to operate in English, we'd be excluding a lot of other voices and have a completely different conversation today. I think what needs to be happening is we need to be operating in all three languages. We need to be ensuring we're including Tamil voices, including Muslim voices, but also not excluding folks who might not speak English as their predominant language in these conversations, because they have a key amount of experience and profession that they bring to the table.
Exactly. And I think it's the challenge is that it's going to be an extremely time-consuming process, but there is no shortcut to an issue or a problem as complicated as this. So I think we have to really take that time that's needed. So Vasanta Dias is also joining the conversation by suggesting us to look at some examples from South Africa about Nelson Mandela and all of that. And I think that's great. You know, one area that we are really weak in is also including global history into our curriculum. So I think thank you for that suggestion, Vasanta. That's a lovely way of contributing to the discussion. We have a question from Shamala Gomez. Thank you for a very interesting presentation. What is your opinion on teaching and learning history and including gender perspective? What did your research throw up and what are your recommendations? Very important again.
Yeah, thank you for that. This is one I've been thinking about for a long time, Shamala, because I think this is one of the short sights in my own research. My research was very much focused on inclusivity along ethno-religious identity. But I think there are so many other versions of what an inclusive history looks like amongst different identity markers. And gender is a key example. There's also class, caste, so many other markers that we should be looking at. I myself don't have a lot of expertise on the lens of gender with Sri Lanka history education, but I think Professor Janaki Jayawardena and scholar Neera Vikramasinghe are both scholars that I really look up to in this regard, that are talking about gender in their research with their students and how we can include it more heavily in our history education curriculum.
Yes, I think that is also another issue that we are going to take a lot of time to address. But, you know, to think that there are sometimes no shortcuts, you really have to go the long way. There was another interesting question raised by Frederick Martin. In your research, did you come across any organizations that you were able to successfully implement reforms in schools?
That's a great question. There's actually an organization in Sri Lanka that I'm very excited about. So there is an organization called Grassrooted Trust. And what they're doing is they're reforming health education in Sri Lanka. So of course, very different than history education, but there's actually very interesting parallels, I think, that we can still learn from their initiatives. So health education, like history education, is pretty taboo in public society that we won't necessarily want to talk about it openly. There's a lot of systemic barriers in our way as it comes to the bureaucracy that's needed to make a history education or health education reform. But what Grassrooted Trust did that I really admire is that two things. One, they started with an initiative that wasn't controversial. So they started with reforming cyberbullying and talking to youth about cyberbullying. That was not controversial. So they were able to get their foot in the door. And after that, they took on more interesting to me, more rich and deep topics like health education in Sri Lanka. And today they actually teach health education. They teach sexual consent in all boys' schools in Sri Lanka, which is really revolutionary. They're at St. Thomas's, St. Peter's, a lot of very well-known all boys schools in Sri Lanka, and have done a great job at doing that through relationships with principals and parents, and not necessarily through going through the Ministry of Education.
Yeah, so we have a very enthusiastic question being repeated, and thank you, Vihenga Pera, for reminding us. Sorry, we are keeping track of about 15 questions here now, so that's why I've been missing yours. So I'll go back to it. Vihenga really wants to get back to the question of what concrete examples can you give from Southeast and South Asian countries with ethno-nationalist pluralistic situation that teaches history without a bias on a majority group. So I'll let Natasha answer that first before going into the second question.
Yes, so I have to say that sadly, I don't have a very good example for you, likely because, for one, I don't think any history is devoid of bias, like I shared in my presentation. but it is extremely hard to implement a history education structure at the mainstream level that's not biased towards the majority. Like I was saying, I think it has to come from multiple avenues. So it would have to be done outside of school, perhaps first, because it's easier to get through those barriers, and then inside school. So there's not one country I can point to that's already doing this inside the classroom at the school level. But I would say that there's so much to learn from the countries that have had experiences similar to Sri Lanka. So I would perhaps point you first to Cambodia as a place that has done a lot of really interesting things with oral history. They have also gone through an ethnic conflict and have many refugees all over the world who have gone through this trauma. And they do a lot of oral history projects, sharing the stories of survivors with the younger youth so that they can learn that history from someone who's been through it. So I think examples like that are really going to be critical for Sri Lanka to learn from as well.
Mhm. Yeah, and I think it's really also important to understand Vihanga's question and the implication of it. The truth is, I don't think there is any country that's doing it perfectly. You know, that is also something that we must acknowledge. You know, United States isn't doing it perfect. No country is doing it perfect. Even South Africa is struggling with it. So, like Natasha just said, I think there is no examples of perfect solutions. All countries are struggling with it. But I think there's a very good reason to join that and really also go beyond our own national context and draw parallels with these efforts and learn from these efforts, like Natasha suggested. For example, Cambodia or even India, there are groups working on it with certain limited successes and failures. So we need to really learn from them. The second question from Vihanga is about, can you briefly elaborate on your field work where you spoke to history teachers in Sri Lanka, places and people in the methodology,
Of course, yes. So I was speaking to historians, educators, policymakers, and organizers. Those were the four groups of people I wanted to look at in my research. And the reason B is because I think those four groups have implemented different history education interventions in all different avenues. So I wanted to look at what reforms have they done and how can we put those different reforms together? What would a shared effort look like in the future? So for historians, Nirmal Devasiri, who spoke in the first series of this webinar, was a really good advisor to me and pointed me in the direction of other historians to speak to. For educators, I attended a few peace camps in Sri Lanka and was able to interview teachers and students in those peace camps. So one peace camp I went to was in Hekadua, and it had youth from all parts of Sri Lanka. So there was Sinhala youth, Muslim youth, Tamil youth. I particularly interviewed a lot of the teachers who were coming from Jaffna, from Batiklo, and talking to them about their experience trying to teach their students Tamil history in the classroom. And that was how I came to learn about how fraught it is, how censored they are, how much repercussions they have for teaching an inclusive history. And for policymakers, a great place for me to start was with GIZ, because they have done a lot of reform to history education by pairing and partnering with government agencies. So they often partner with the Office for National Unity and Reconciliation, the ONUR, and have a seat at the table at talking about history education, which is unique for a non-governmental organization to have a seat at the table. So they were fascinating to learn about their teaching training programs. They have a website, historicaldialogue.lk, where they have virtual museums and history, like new forms of history, of new methods of looking at history through a more engaging multimedia that they do through there. And Yeah, so it was a big mix of people, but it was looking at how can we see where there's opportunity. One opportunity that I think is exciting is that CARE, which is a international NGO, did a program with youth from all over the country. They called Youth Care, where they brought youth from Sinhala speaking regions, Tamil speaking regions, and led projects on learning about ancient folk art with both languages in mind. But what was interesting to me was that the parents of these Sinhala and Tamil students and the teachers came with the students on this long journey through the country and weren't really done in any interventions with them. We didn't really see the parents or teachers being included in the curriculum. So then I thought to myself, what if GIZ, their initiative on teacher training, what if they were doing that at the same time with Sinhala and Tamil teachers while CARE was doing their program with the youth? So I think like that, there are many opportunities that we can find.
Yeah, thank you. So I'm going to just make a quick announcement saying that we are probably going to take 15 minutes more to wrap up the session, although we have reached 7:30 and the line that we should actually stop. But I don't really want to stop this discussion because it's so important and we have few more questions that really deserve to be taken up. So I am going to extend the session for 15 minutes more. And the next question is going to be actually anonymous. There is no name to it, but it's a very interesting question. He or she says, I don't remember most of the history I was taught at school, even though I took school exams seriously. Maybe most students are simply forgetting the biased history that they were taught, since it is all about cramming for an exam. Good point, yeah? And the real sources of the biased views of Sri Lanka is elsewhere. For example, movies, books, drama, social media, etc. What do you think of that? I think it's a fascinating observation.
It is. There's a lot of really interesting research being done right now on the outside forces that play a role in history education. And I think TV and media is one of the key examples. I mentioned teledramas a few times in my presentation and a bit more in my research, but there are some really interesting teledramas on air that are impacting heavily the bias in history education that we see. I think that you're right, that we often forget the history education we learn in our grade school levels and that we're learning our bias from everywhere. At the same time, I think that there's something missing in our history education classrooms that would give us the skills to question even the media that's biased that we're being presented. And that is two things. One, critical thinking and questioning skills. The idea that we should question what is being presented to us, that we should ask ourselves, is this biased? We should ask ourselves, whose perception is this and whose perception is it excluding? That skill to teach someone to question is really missing in our school system because of the prioritization that memorization is given, that preparing for exams is given. And then the second thing that I think is crucial to us learning, even at the academic level, that would help us as we interpret media and all types of things in our adulthood, is that history is biased. History is not absolute truth. It is not like science or math. It's not like these other disciplines. It is always stories. It is always perceptions of the past that are passed down to us. And those perceptions always exclude voices and always prioritize others. So the more we talk to youth in the classroom and everywhere really about history being biased and about their ability, their power to question what they're presented, I think the more our future generations will be prepared for any media that comes their way.
Exactly. So another question from Shamala Gomes. She says, it's also about how history is taught. I think she's referring to pedagogy here, not only what is taught. For example, tools such as role plays, drama, songs, creative means to engage students more than just lecturing. These methodologies need to be used by teachers across the board. This can be only done through the ministry and NIE. So that's kind of a comment and a question. Any thoughts on that, Natasha?
I think you're absolutely right. And I think there are really exciting things happening. When I was in Sri Lanka 2 years ago, I was able to go to a play that Youth Create put on through their program, that CARE, the NGO, put on through this Youth Create initiative. And this play had Sinhala youth and Tamil youth in the play together. And they had actually taught Sinhala youth the Tamil speaking roles and Tamil youth the Sinhala speaking roles. So they were teaching the children how each other's languages, how to talk to each other, but they were also telling shared stories in their play. They were telling a history that both groups took part in. And both groups learned the history through acting it out through a play in costume and in fun that I think will stick with them down the road far more than ever reading a textbook would.
Here's a question from Tina. How can we influence the present government of Sri Lanka to adapt such findings in order to bridge this gap of history education? Toughy, but do you want to attempt that?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think that, well, I'll share one misconception that I had prior to my research that I think was broken as I got into it. When I approached my research, I said, okay, I know that textbooks are fully distributed, created within the Sri Lankan government. I know that there's a lot of barriers to implementing reform and that people are going to be very resistant to all of the ideas that we could have about inclusive history. And part and parcel, there are places where that are true, but I also came to realize, talking to people in government seats, that they too want change. One woman who I spoke to for a long time, Chandamadan Napala, she's one of two people who focuses on history at the National Institute of Education. They are working on the history curriculum that is being passed down, that teachers' guides that teachers are using in the classroom. And she was the one telling me that, hey, we use translators that translate word by word. We use translators that are professional translators, but not historians. So our Tamil and Muslim youth are being given textbooks that sometimes don't make sense to them, that aren't being translated for historical meaning. And she was the one who said the NIE would be so much better off if we had more Tamil voices, if we had Tamil historians in our seats doing this work. So I think that that is really exciting to me, that there are people inside the government who also really want to change.
Exactly, and thank you for reminding us that, and to look for the opportunities that are there and not to really look at it from a blanket perspective. So there's another question from Nirmi Vitharana. Natasha, in the present ethnopolitical context of Sri Lanka, how realistic would it be to witness reform in history education? Another toughie, but I'd like to see how you tackle that actually.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think that looking at it, it's such a big obstacle. At the same time, I think, like I left on with my conclusion, I think every time we say that to ourselves and we don't do it, every time we say this is too big of a monster and we can't tackle, every day that we do that, youth are in classrooms learning a history that has a really big impact on what they will do as adults in our society. So if they don't learn the history, if they don't learn the violence that occurred, they're not prepared to stop the violence when they're in those places. They're not prepared to recognize the patterns, to put an end to it, to intervene. So I think we need to reframe history education as something that is imperative. It doesn't matter that it's a hard monster to tackle. It matters that it is too important to not tackle. And when I think about the monster, I think about how it has many, many arms. And yes, it's textbook arm, it's teaching arm, it's curriculum arm. Those are big ones and ones that are going to take years, if not generations, to change, but there are lower hanging fruit that we should be climbing towards. There is interventions in peace camps and outside of classroom curriculum. There is media that we can be showing youth, oral histories we can be sharing. There's a lot of things we can do on our own accord without anyone in our way, and we should be going towards those.
Okay, so I think I'm going to wrap the session with one question that I think is a good question to end on. And this is also with apologies to others who have posed a few more interesting questions that unfortunately even our 15-minute extension didn't allow us to address. But what we can do, as we did with Jagat, is to get back to you with a few answers from Natasha's side. So Nilani Joseph, Vasanta Dias, Anina, Madhivan, who have raised questions, please bear with us and we will get back to you, and on our Facebook page where we can also post some of the questions that were not answered. But I'll take up this question by Deepthi as the final one. Do you think making history a non-examination subject in schools could be a good starting point? Maybe introduce assignment-based assessment. I really like that question. So what's your thought on that? And then we will wrap up.
I love that question. One of my favorite things to do is think about the different pedagogies we could use and how we could put those in place. And I think the exam-oriented context is giving us a lot of restraints that are hard to overcome. It's giving us the rote memorization, the very strict lecture structure that we see today. If we didn't have exams, we then get the question, okay, but how do we incentivize youth to learn? How do we encourage them to care and to participate in their learning? And I think the idea that youth don't care is also a very big misconception. I think the more we teach inclusive histories, the more youth are interested. For example, I think if there was more curriculum on Muslim history, we would see Muslim youth having a bigger interest in the subject of history. So that's for one. And second, I think participation is a really interesting concept to consider what a new pedagogy can look like. So there are many classrooms throughout different levels that grade on participation rather than on an exam at the end of the day. And of course that can create systems where you're participating for the sake of it. You don't actually care. But I think even just encouraging students to take up space in the classroom, encouraging students to ask questions, students to give answers, will turn the model on its head.
So thank you very much, Natasha, for this really lovely presentation. It has really brought up many issues at the ground level onto the table and given us an understanding of how urgent it is to tackle these questions.